Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. I am an experienced Forge in the Dark GM, and I'm here to give you my advice 10 minutes at a time. In my videos, I've been using some terminology without really defining it, and that's no good. So I figured today I would go back, slow down a little, and talk about what fiction first actually means. It's really easy to overthink fiction first or to put it on some kind of weird pedestal, and my goal today is to bring it back down to earth for you, define it, give you some examples, and then talk about fiction first systems like Candela Obscura. And the fact is, you're probably already using a fiction first approach and don't even realize it. So, what is fiction first? Well, it's an approach or process for playing an RPG. When you're using a fiction-first approach, as a player, what you're doing is describing what the character is trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish, and then the group is going to figure out what mechanics to use, if any, for this particular situation, led by the Dungeon Master or Game Master, and then there's going to be a roll if that's needed. The opposite of fiction first is a mechanics first scenario. In such a situation, the player is going to describe what mechanic they want to use, then they're going to make a roll if it's required by that mechanic. So, what do I mean by that? Let's look at an example here. So, the player says, Rowan uses sleight of hand to pick the lock. This is a 100% mechanics first approach, if we're talking about D&D. Because there's a skill called sleight of hand, it's used for picking locks, and that is the rule that's being led by, not the fiction. But what if a player instead said, Rowan pulls out a lockpick, inserts it into the lock, trying to quietly open it? Or maybe, Rowan pours gunpowder into the keyhole and strikes a match. Or maybe, Rowan checks the make of the lock, hoping she has the right skeleton key. These are all fiction-first approaches. They lead with how the character is approaching the situation in a way that fits the fiction, that doesn't really think about what kind of rules are being used, or in the very least is putting the fiction side of it first and the rules secondary. From here, the table, led by the GM, is going to figure out what rule makes sense. In Candela Obscura, depending on the approach, could be something like a control check, could be hide, could be strike, could be focus. This is what a Forge in the Dark game calls the conversation. In this part where you're talking about it, we're looking at what action makes the most sense, how effective might it be, the expectations, and how risky it is, the stakes. Did that make sense? Let's do one more here. Mechanics first. Sammy takes the attack action against the guard. Or fiction first. Sammy slugs the guard with brass knuckles, trying to KO them. Sammy grapples the guard to the ground, trying to subdue them. Sammy sneaks up behind the guard and sucker punches them. What's important here is the player is describing the action without regard for the rules. The player is using the context of the moment to inform their choices, and the player is expressing their character and adding to the story. That's it. That's all fiction first means. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about why we want to use fiction first. And to do that, we'll start with a mechanics first approach and some of the things that maybe aren't as good here. First is it's bland. It removes interesting descriptions. It removes expression from the game. It is purely mechanical and not very engaging. It's also incomplete. When you are using a mechanics-first approach, you can only do the things that have corresponding rules. And if there's anything that lies outside of those rules, the only way to engage with them is taking a fiction-first approach and saying, my character wants to do this thing that's not in the rules. How would I do that, storyteller? All right? And the third is it's non-contextual. It doesn't take into account whatever is currently happening. The rule in a mechanics-first approach is the same no matter what circumstance there may happen to be. With fiction first as an approach, instead you're painting a word picture. You're embellishing the scene. You're putting your character in the moment and showing how they specifically interact with the world in a way that might be different than another character. It lets you attempt novel things, propose things that the rules can't handle outside of the box, and use creative solutions you'd never otherwise considered. You can be inspired by the moment. You can use the terrain. You can hit someone where they've already been hurt, etc. And lastly, you can play to find out what happens. The story changes based on the consequences of the character's specific and novel actions. Ultimately, leading with the fiction in descriptions is just a lot more fun. It's a lot more dynamic than you might otherwise see. And this brings us to fiction-first games. A fiction-first game is one that's designed to embrace a fiction-first approach, primarily. And it's impossible for me to tell you exactly what the definition of the properties of this kind of game. It's like trying to define horror or sci-fi. They're very slippery, like what is steampunk anyways? But I can talk about some trends. First is, fiction-first games tend to have more abstract mechanics. If the mechanics were too specific, they wouldn't be able to easily handle novel situations. So rather than overly define a mechanic, instead what you're doing is you're creating some kind of way to approach any possible situations. This includes things like actions in Forged in the Dark and moves in Powered by the Apocalypse, rather than having specific skills that do specific things. And they also tend to have fewer combat mechanics for the exact same reason. Fiction-first games tend to use mixed success. Since the context matters in a fiction-first approach, it's hard to know where the story is going to go, and as a result, it's very hard to prep encounters in advance. And since you can't prep encounters in advance, or it's very difficult, instead, mixed successes are better at creating an adversarial situation and pushing the action forward. Fiction-first games tend toward shorter-term campaigns, and honestly, I'm not sure why. If you have a theory about this one, please leave it in the comments. I am generally puzzled as to why this seems to emerge fairly standardly. Fiction-first games also very character-focused. How the character approaches a problem is very important. We therefore need to know more about our character in order to portray them truthfully. For the same reason, I find them less concerned with character death. And it doesn't happen as often, or it's not as prominent in the rules of a game. Since characters are more fleshed out, it's easy to find non-deadly ways to make those characters experience suffering, or to take things away from them, or to make their lives more difficult. And you're not in a situation where the only thing that matters to the character is their own life. And then lastly, fiction-first games give more authorities to players to create the world. Interpreting rules on the spot requires trust from both the players and the GM's side. And we already let players assert how they are going to solve their character's problems in a very free-form way. Letting players assert more about a character's reality just makes sense in this kind of world. We are creating a shared consensus about what the character's reality is like. And this is why the writer's room mindset has really taken root in these fiction-first games. Now, I don't think this list is exhausted, but I do think that this kind of ties the room together, as it were. So I do hope that this gives you insight into what fiction-first means. I told you not to overthink it, and if all went well here, now you understand why. Last thing I'll say, if you do have the Blades in the Dark book, pages 161, 162 are required reading. I was heavily influenced by that section in recording this video, as well as a couple of Reddit threads that I watched. I wanted to get a consensus of what other people were doing in this space before I proclaimed my sense of what fiction first is, because this is everyone's hobby, and these are non-precise things, and we're all kind of figuring out how it's going on the fly and assembling the tracks directly in front of the train in this crazy hobby. Anyways, I've been DM Rawlings, your 10-minute DM, and if you like what you see, hit the subscribe button. Have a pleasant holidays.